All right, everybody. I'm going to welcome Ravi on the stage. I have known Ravi for 20 years. He and I worked together at my first startup, and so if you catch him in the hallway after, he has tons of embarrassing stories about me. But that is not what our fireside chat is about. After that, he became a product leader at TripAdvisor, Meta, Tinder. He's started companies before. He teaches the Reforge AI strategy and AI prototyping course. And somewhere along all of this, he actually has time to build his own products with AI. So I felt like Ravi would be the perfect person for us to end the day with, to be able to bring together that perspective from being a product leader to working with companies to building himself. Let's all welcome Ravi to the stage. All right.
Hey, Brian.
We're ending the day. I feel like we need to make some spicy, bold statements.
All right, that sounds good.
Okay,
yeah,
you're up for that?
Let's do it.
I'm going to start off, and there's one thing that I feel like really sort of communicates the through line through all of this and summarize everything, which is that I think every company, startup or incumbent, is essentially back to zero on product market fit. AI has kind of reset the clock, and it's kind of resetting the clock over and over again every 6 months. Agree or disagree, and why?
I totally agree with that. 18 months ago, if you asked who would be the leader in terms of enterprise spending versus OpenAI versus Anthropic, you would have said for sure OpenAI. But Ramp just recently released the Ramp AI Index, and for the first time, Anthropic has actually surpassed OpenAI in terms of spending. And I think that that highlights the fact that things are moving so quickly. We're seeing a PMF reset unlike we've seen before. We've seen something similar with the internet and with mobile. Both cases, companies had to really rethink their products. In internet, it was how do we make these cloud collaborative? And in mobile, it was like how do we shrink down the experience into something that's really accessible? But I think AI is an even bigger shift, and even the incumbents need to constantly keep iterating in order to maintain relevance. And what we've seen is the OpenAI and Anthropic were kind of focusing on different directions. Anthropic's focused more on building platforms through MCP and skills and Claude Code. OpenAI has focused more on the app layer with advertising, with some apps like Sora. And that change in sort of focus has led to a shift in market share. And I think we'll continue to see that. One of the things that makes us really different than prior platform shifts, however, is the fact that this shifts tend to benefit the incumbents rather than the startups. And so we're seeing companies like Adobe, for example, Miro, for example, leaning into the products that they already have, building with AI really quickly and getting a benefit from there, which is quite different than the internet shifts and the mobile shifts, which benefited startups much more. So I think a key question for everyone in the room to keep asking every 6 months is, what are the unique assets that we have? What's the unique data? What are the unique workflows? What are the unique customer insights? And really build on those unique assets. Because you don't necessarily need to win in the model layer, but you do need to win in the platform and process layer.
Yeah, I think one of the challenging things is when we think about product market fit, we often think about the product, but the other piece of this that's resetting is not just the product, but the pricing and the monetization model. Everything that's happening on the distribution side, the shape of our teams internally, like how we work, and it feels like a fire hose like all at once. And with the previous shifts that you're talking about, like mobile and stuff, I felt like we had more of that sort of happen in a sequence versus all at once. But it's just like, here it is.
Yeah,
good luck.
It's so rapid.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, this feels like it sets up. You talked a little bit about the question you need to be asking yourself around your competitive advantage and your unique assets. It feels like this sets up a very complex environment to navigate product strategy. And I'm just interested as you sort of monitor the landscape, are there products, companies, strategic moves that you just find really interesting or fascinating or as good examples? And what are they and why?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting examples is competition over the last 12 months or so has not centered as much around the models as it has around the tooling around those models. And that's an area, going back to the OpenAI versus Anthropic question, that's an area where Anthropic's really leaned into the tooling. And so if you look at some of the things that we think about as really innovative in terms of the last few months, it hasn't been that the models changed fundamentally, but the harness that the model has been built into has changed. And so 3 examples I think are really interesting. Perplexity was able to get market share by essentially combining the power of the model with the power of web search. The next really interesting example of that was Claude Code. So it wasn't that the Claude coding model was so much better than what came before, and the same models were available in Cursor, in GitHub Copilot. But what was different was Claude Code was a command line tool, and as a result, it had access to thousands of other command line tools. I think the most recent example of this has been OpenClaw. The reason OpenClaw is interesting is not because there's a single line of frontier model code in the code base, but because of the harnesses that OpenClaw makes available. And so oftentimes what we're seeing is that the innovation right now is in the tooling rather than in the models. One of the sayings I really like around this is MIT's motto is mind and hands, and that motto is meant to denote that you can be the most intelligent person in the world, you can be a savant structural engineer, but if you go and you try to build a house without a saw or without hands, you're not going to be able to do it. And I think the AI models are the minds. They've gotten sufficiently capable, and now the innovation is how do we give them access to tooling, how do we give them access to processes and workflows and plug them into our systems in a way that they can create a lot of value for our companies.
Yeah, I know one of the examples that you've used in the AI strategy course for Reforge, and you've talked about recently, is Descript, and they've made a couple different moves. So talk a little bit about that and what you feel like is interesting around that.
Yeah, so one of the interesting questions around tooling is, well, isn't the AI smart enough to create its own tooling? If AI can generate code, can it just generate its own tools? And it is getting much better at that. There was recently a case where Anthropic wanted to completely unattended see how far Claude Code could get on building a complex piece of software. And so they decided to have it build a C compiler from scratch with 0 help during the process. Claude Code ran for a week unattended, and at the end of that, it was able to actually compile the Linux kernel. So it was able to go from 0 to a very complicated build over a period of about 5 or 6 days. It generated 100,000 lines of code. So to some extent, AI can create its own tools, but the footnote there is that it actually cost $20,000 in tokens, and it took a week to do that. So if you needed to compile an app, you don't want to spend $20,000 and wait a week for that to happen. And so the existing software products that we have available are essentially the superpowers that we can make available to AI. And a company I think that is doing this really well right now is Descript. Descript has disrupted the video editing space by creating a script-based editor where you can edit not based on a traditional timeline, but actually edit using spoken word. So it'll use AI for transcripts, and then you can edit that transcript. And what they've done recently, which I think is very interesting, is they've created the Descript API, which makes all of that editing functionality available to agents. And so now you can build video editing workflows directly into your systems. I think a lot of companies try to keep those sorts of assets close to the vest. But in the case of Descript saying, actually, we're going to open up, we're going to create an API for this, I think that's like a bold strategic move and something that's going to pay dividends, because if you can have a software superpower that's hard for the AI to replicate, that's a sustainable and durable asset.
Yeah. Okay, so as Chief Growth Officer, I think about growth a lot and distribution. And there's been a narrative that I feel like has popped up again recently, which is that distribution is everything. And it's kind of become the hard thing again. I think it's always been hard personally, but I think it's always been hard. But I'm interested why you think this is cropping up now, or in other words, just tell me what I should do as Chief Growth Officer.
I don't know if I can do that.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting is if we look at this from a first principles level, there's certain things that move at AI speed, generating code, generating documents, generating tickets. And there's certain things that move at human speed. Our customers have limited attention, their ability to understand our product offering, their ability to start using it, to adopt into it, to onboard and activate into the product is still working at human speed. And so to this morning's keynote, we're seeing this inversion from 80% of the work used to be on execution and 20% on the strategy and the thinking. Because that 80% is now moving so much faster, the focal point has moved to the strategy, the customer adoption, the discovery, the alignment, all of the things that require humans to be in the loop. And because of this, it's meant that the challenge as companies has moved from execution to how do we get our products into people's hands, how do we make them aware of them, how do we actually get them to be able to use them successfully, as well as use all of these new features that we are creating. So I think that's the number one distribution challenge is that's not moving at the same speed. Meanwhile, the distribution channels themselves are changing quite a bit. SEO has really changed fundamentally. It used to be that if you had a user-generated content SEO loop, that was a moat that you could count on forever and ever. Companies like Yelp and Stack Overflow and Chegg were counting on that. But that went away almost overnight because all of that got subsumed into the LLM's training data. And so SEO is under a lot of pressure. Market share is moving from Google to ChatGPT and Claude, so shares moving. There's no distribution channel that's yet taken shape. AEO is still in its early days. So I think what's interesting is, it used to be that if we felt like we had 100,000 lines of code, that was an asset that we could count on. And now I think 1 million followers is worth a lot more than a couple 100,000 lines of code, because that is the hard to replicate asset, because that requires humans to be in the loop rather than AI just to be in the loop.
So you're saying I should become an influencer? Is that
I think so, yeah.
Is that right? Yeah, if my good looks, maybe I'll be able to do that. No, I mean, this is one that I find really challenging for all the reasons. I personally feel the human absorption a ceiling, right? Like as new things come out,
yeah.
I love trying new things, but in the back of my head, I'm like, well, if I just wait 30 days, maybe the thing that I'm already using will launch the same thing, so I end up in this weird mentality. But I think Andrew Chen, who helped start Reforge with me, and I many years ago wrote this article called "The Law of Shitty Click-Throughs," right? Which was the whole natural cycle of distribution, tactics, and arbitrage, which is, to find distribution, you have to be doing something different in a channel. And as you do something different and that thing is working, others naturally notice.
Yeah.
They copy, they commoditize, it becomes less effective. And so it goes through this natural cycle. And I felt like previously that, myself as a human, if I was really plugged in and I was really tuned in, could spot these patterns and take advantage of them early. But that cycle is compressing so fast now that it's even hard to do that as a professional. And so I do wonder how AI creates the new distribution problems, but how AI will also be inserted into finding and detecting these opportunities as well. And I just don't know how that resolves.
I don't know either. I think it's this incredibly tough push and pull between what works, what the arbitrage opportunity is, finding those opportunities, taking advantage of them, and then finding the next one. I think it was the case for many years that multiple distribution opportunities were sort of stacking. So as soon as one got to a point where it was saturating, you could move on to the next one. I think right now it's not really clear what the big distribution opportunity is, because AEO hasn't really played out yet. We're still in the early days of advertising within answer engines. There's some interesting things on the creator and the influencer side, but just overall, I think distribution is a big question mark. And it's the hard thing right now, and that kind of goes back to what we were talking about, which is the hardest part is going to be how do you get the humans in the loop completely aligned, completely up to speed.
Yeah, and so, and of course, one of the things that has been moving along is the adoption of, there's been this movement around kind of agent-first adoption, or I'm going to make my product available for agents. But you said a line to me earlier, which I thought was interesting, which is complicated software is bad for both humans and for agents. Like, neither of us are going to like it.
Yeah.
Both of us are going to hit some sort of capacity. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think that to me has been a surprising thing. It used to be that, like, if you're creating an API, you would want your API to have as many endpoints as possible because you would want to surface all of the functionality that your product has, and a human developer would go in, understand that API, understand what part of that they wanted to integrate, and build a really interesting thing based on the power that you offered them through that API. But it's the case that humans have a hard time, individual consumer users have a hard time using complicated products because they don't have time to do the work that the developer did and figure out what narrow subset of functionality is really going to work for us. It's also the case that agents have limited cognitive capacity, right? They have a context window. That context window can get overwhelmed. And so when they're trying to deal with too much complexity, they have a hard time using a very wide portfolio of tools. And so what's interesting, going back to the Descript API example, was I was thinking this must be a very complicated API given all of the video editing functionality that they have. But instead, they have one main endpoint where the agent gives the other agent in natural language instructions on the edits that they want to make to the video. And so the one agent is talking natural language, the other agent is talking natural language, and that simplification of that interface actually makes makes a better product for the user, but it also makes a much better interface for agents.
Interesting. Okay. So, all right, so we talked a little bit about product strategy, a little bit about distribution, but this is also, a big common theme has just been how teams are working differently and product teams are working differently. I'm just interested from your perspective, what do you think product teams need to unlearn? Just like take the axe to? Yeah.
I think we got to unlearn our best practices, because if you think about the best practices, what were they designed to solve for? Like, one of our best practices is minimum viable product. How many customers want a product that just barely solves their need? Nobody, right? The MVP as a best practice was not designed for customers, it was actually designed for us. And the reason it was designed for us is because it used to be that working software was really expensive. So if you wanted to build working software, what you did is you sort of traded off effort for signal, and you only started to build, you only delayed building until you had a really significant amount of conviction. And so our old product lifecycle is based on start with the spec, it's really cheap to build, then maybe you do a wireframe, then maybe you do a detailed design, and you sort of climb this escalation path of signal and effort, hoping to build up conviction, and if you have enough conviction, then you'd invest the massive amount of resources that it would take to go and build software. But if you didn't have conviction, you would go back to zero. But now the cost of working software has collapsed. It's sometimes faster to build a prototype than it is to write a spec. A spec could be 5 pages long. A prompt just needs to be a couple of lines long. And so when that fundamental constraint of the old product development lifecycle has collapsed, we need to rethink how we build. And I think a key part of that is to think about how do you make working software an essential part of your product development lifecycle from the very first moment, from when you're ideating all the way through to when you deliver, so that it's a critical part of not just what we deliver at the end, but also our discovery. And that enables us for the first time to really shift from building only to ship to building to learn. And if we're building to learn, we can actually learn much faster, we can learn much better, and it allows us to elevate our bar from minimum viable product, which we needed to do before because we had to manage the cost of building the wrong product, to building minimum lovable products, which actually achieve the aspiration that we had when we set out to solve a particular problem for customers.
Yeah, I think part of that and what you were talking about is like there's all these old methodologies, like A/B testing was the main valid form of learning, but AI has sort of introduced a new form of learning, not just building to learn as kind of what you're talking about, but just how quant used to be scarce, and now it's more on qual. But so talk a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I think because it was hard to build things, we only built things once we had a strong amount of conviction. And then at that point, you could build something, you run it as an experiment, and whether or not something lives or dies depends on the experimentation results. So as companies, we got very data oriented, but that was just partly an artifact of the process that we had to work with because building software is expensive. Now, if we can build a working piece of software, we can give it to our customer support team, we can give it to our sales team, we can give it to our customers. We can actually get much more qualitative data earlier in the process. We can actually use AI to help us get insights from that data, and that gives us more types of information with which to triangulate, and as a result, it helps us zone in on the right type of product. One of the analogies I like to use in our AI prototyping course is that prototyping is kind of like a sketch if you were going to create an oil painting. So if you're creating an oil painting, oil painters don't just put paint on a blank canvas because paint is hard to work with and it's very expensive to iterate and you're not going to end up with a great result. And so instead, you write in an easy-to-use medium, you write and sketch in pencil, you figure out your competition, your composition, you figure out your goals, and then once you finish that sketch, you throw it away by painting over it to get the exact product that you want. And so that way of working where you're combining, I think, both the sketch as well as the end result can get you to much better products.
Yeah. So it feels like a common theme from the distribution of this is certain things accelerating at AI speed that gives us new advantages, creates new bottlenecks, things that move at human speed still move at human speed. And so I'm just interested, kind of having seen inside other product teams and either through the courses or through your advising, where do you think leaders are specifically going wrong on this front?
I think one of the hardest things is, going back to the idea that working software is expensive, the thing that we created to solve for that was an assembly line. And an assembly line is like a sequence of risk-gated milestones. And so you only go from one stage to the other when you have enough conviction. You only go from ideation into spec, into design, into launch, into experimentation when you have high conviction. Because that whole process is collapsed, we don't need an assembly line model any longer. We can use a model where I think it works much more like a jazz band. The model doesn't collapse where everyone is basically playing the same role, but it does collapse to a point where everyone can riff off each other in different ways. So we still have our instruments to play. We still have our spikes and talents that we bring to the table, but we can collaborate in a much more fluid way. And because we're collaborating in a much more fluid way, that's going to mean that there's a little bit more stepping on each other's toes. It's hard to be, I think one of the things that's really going to hurt organizations that are trying to get AI native is to be territorial about what is your job versus what is not your job. Anyone can now create a prototype. I think teams and leaders need to get okay with, we're going to sometimes do duplicative work, we're going to sometimes throw away work, we're sometimes going to cross over on team lines, all with the goal of getting to a better end product because we're going through this walk to discover what the customer really wants as a result of being able to work with AI to help us get there. And so that comes back to a very human thing, which is being comfortable with failure, being comfortable with iteration, being comfortable with blurry lines. But the organizations that can do that really well, I think, are very well set up to take full advantage of AI and not sort of try to keep AI as well as teams in a lane that just doesn't apply anymore.
The jazz band feels like way easier for startups to implement. Big companies.
Yeah.
Do you think it works?
I think it does work. I think that's how people want to build.
I do think it's how people prefer to build. Yes, yeah.
And if we go back to what Tomer was talking about earlier, we do have to fundamentally change the roles, and that means that certain things flatten, and leaders need to get comfortable with that, giving teams the autonomy to be able to experiment, to be able to build, and leaders need to understand that's essential to move at the speed that's necessary right now.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I learned when I was at TripAdvisor is the CEO had a motto, which is speed wins. He had a sign on his door. He really lived this. Every new hiring class got a sort of seminar on what it meant to move fast. And one of the things I realized was that moving fast is actually less about velocity, it's less about the volume of things that you do, and it's much more about latency. And so a litmus test question we would ask is, what's the time it takes to go from having an idea for a better name for a button and actually being able to get that live on the site? Like, let's say we had a button that says book now, and we knew that it would convert better if it says reserve. How long would that take us to get live on the site? And in some companies, that's a month, and in other companies, that's a day. And the difference there is the latency. And the thing that latency gives you is it gives you multiple at-bats. So it gives you the ability to be able to take a lot of swings, to have some misses, but to iterate and learn on a floor that keeps getting higher and higher. And so I think that's an essential part of how we work. And leaders who kind of absorb that and understand that moving fast is not just doing more stuff, it's actually being able to learn faster, it's being able to have more at-bats, and it's being comfortable with a faster rate of failure as well as a faster rate of learning. I think we're in a really great position.
Okay, last question. Want to make sure everybody walks away with something actionable. If you're in product or you're a product leader, they're watching this and they can change only one thing about how they're operating tomorrow morning, what would it be?
Yeah, I think it depends on the level of maturity that your org has around AI. For early maturity orgs, the ones who are still trying to climb this learning curve, I think there's generally three types of people. There's the AI enthusiasts who are already using AI to work 10x faster. There are the AI curious who are excited about AI but just don't know where to start. And there's the AI skeptics who are leaning back. And the number one thing that a leader can do in those types of organizations is figure out how to get the AI curious to become the AI enthusiast. And that means getting the AI enthusiast to mentor those who are curious, to do brown bag sessions, to give access to tools, to do everything possible to help them climb that learning curve. And if you can solve for that, you can get a much wider set of your organization to really lean into AI and get the value from it. There's other companies that we're talking to now that have been through this process. They've climbed the learning curve, and what they're finding is they're building at an astonishing rate, both production features as well as prototypes. And for them, there's an interesting new challenge. A lot of our role as product builders has been fundamentally about prioritization. When it's expensive to build products, we have to figure out what we need to build, and we have to be really sure about it. And that role is moving from prioritization to curation. When we can build lots of things, the really important thing is not to ship everything that we build, but to make sure that what we do ship really matters for the company. And so for those later companies, I think being able to shift from a prioritization-oriented culture to a curation-oriented culture is really important. And that will show up in how you ideate, how you do product reviews, how you do testing, how you do customer validation. All of those things need to become more curation-oriented.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
If you're working on this stuff, highly recommend you reaching out to Ravi. He's one of the clearest thinkers I know on this. Let's thank Ravi for coming out today.